Welcome back. Richard, it's good to see you this morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you, my sir?
Oh, I know what it was. How many Sundays left until Christmas?
I thought that was a long pause.
Yeah, right.
I heard today that we're about 100 days away from Christmas.
I was thinking, yeah, about 12 or 13 Sundays until Christmas, and that was a scary thought.
Yes,
so,
yes.
But people are beginning to talk about it already. So,
right.
Otherwise, you're good. Everything's good over there.
Yeah, we're doing well. And but because we're that close to Christmas, what that means is that we are well into the school year.
Well, that's the other thing. Schools around the country start at different times.
Right.
Here in Florida, we start as early as possible in August, about the first or second week of August. Other schools don't open until after Labor Day.
Right.
By the mid to late September, school is, well, we would say school is in full swing.
Yes.
But I don't think we can use that phrase accurately anymore.
Well, we're going to return to talk about schools today because it is one of our favorite topics. Favorite not because we really enjoy talking about what's going on, but enjoy because it's something that we really need to talk about.
We have to talk about it because
there's so much going on, and as the title of today's podcast suggests, our schools need us more than ever now because of all that's going on. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Right. Yeah, and we begin with some of the data from, and everybody, well, not everybody should be asking, what was the effect of the pandemic on children's, the acquisition of academic skills? And we know there's some effect because, you're not allowed to miss school if you're younger than 16. It's that important. And we know that an extended absence can have a devastating effect. When I say extended absence, I mean a student misses 3 or 4 days or a week of school, and they start to get behind in a hurry.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have to remember that during the pandemic, students missed not weeks of school, but some missed a whole September of classroom instruction. And so researchers are now beginning to investigate what the effect of that lost instructional time is on the acquisition of academic skills.
Right.
And one of the things they learned, and one of the first article we'll post, is the results of a test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP. And it is a standardized test that is given around the country. Every state has its own tests.
Right.
But this is the only test that you give to students who live everywhere in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been using it since the 1970s. And since the 1970s, these scores have gradually increased from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Then in the late 90s to early 2000s, they sort of plateaued. And we then began to talk about what was called the achievement gap,
mm-hmm.
which is that the students who did well in school, and then there were students who don't do well in school, and we had a hard time closing that achievement gap. And much of our schooling from the late 1990s, early 2000s was how do we get these underperforming students to perform better? So we saw things like standardized tests, high stakes tests, school grades, teacher grades. What can we do to close that achievement gap? Well, then the pandemic hit in 2000. And so researchers said, well, let's compare the scores.
Well, 2020.
2020, sorry.
Yeah.
So in 2020, the pandemic hit. So researchers now saying, okay, let's compare the scores in 2020 with the scores in 2022. Mm-hmm. And what they discovered was that there was for the first time in the history of the NAEP, for the first time in 30 years, the test scores dropped. It's the first time in 30 years that they actually showed a decline. And the problem with the decline is not so much its size, though it's impressive. It's that the students who are in the top 10% of the class had a 3%, had about a 3-point drop in performance. Whereas the students in the bottom 10%, the underachievers, showed a 12-point loss.
Right.
And so what this means is that those who could least afford the time off suffered the most.
Right.
And so another way to look at this is that the average student lost the equivalent of 22 weeks of instruction.
Right. Because 1 point equals about 3 weeks of learning.
About 3 weeks of learning, right? They've been able to calculate this. And so not only have all students lost instructional time and instructional skills, but the students who could least afford to lose time, in fact, lost the most points. And what they attribute that to is that if you remember, I know you remember because you were directly involved in it, when the pandemic first hit and everything, schools shut down and we did online instruction. Well, if you didn't have a computer and a high-speed internet,
right,
you couldn't do online instruction. Kids were trying to do instruction with their cell phones.
Right.
And so if you lived in a home that had several computers and a high-speed internet connection, and you were computer savvy, or your parents were computer savvy, you lost skills, or you didn't acquire them quickly, but you were still acquiring them. If you didn't have a computer, do you remember when schools gave computers out to families?
Mm-hmm.
And at the beginning of the pandemic, schools actually passed out computers to families that didn't have them. Those kids, and we're talking about kids in poverty, lost the most. Okay.
Right.
And so,
and that makes sense because again, one of the things we talk about every year at the start of the summer break is that if students don't perform, practice their academic skills over the summer, especially reading, when they return at the beginning of the next school year, they lose, several levels of reading performance from the end of school and at the beginning of June or so to the beginning of school, from the end of June or the beginning of June to the beginning of August. They can lose a lot of skills just simply from not practicing. And so when the school shut down in March or so of 2020 and didn't resume for many of them until August at the earliest. At the earliest,
right.
For some, it was even later than that. And let's be honest, that fourth quarter of the 2019-2020 school year, there wasn't a lot of academics that were really done.
Right.
Most school systems were just like, they weren't prepared, they weren't equipped. And so it was just sort of, let's just sustain. I know a lot of the school districts around here, for example, said, if a student is doing more poorly during that fourth quarter than they did previously, they just gave them the same grade that they got in the third quarter.
That's right.
Regardless of what they did in the fourth quarter. So that fourth quarter, there wasn't a lot of learning and academic engagement or anything like that happening. And so they lost so much time. And so when they started back school, they were much farther behind than anticipated.
That's right. And we still talk to parents who say, well, she lost the last 9 weeks, and then there was the summer. And then we tried online learning for the first semester. Right. And some families continued into the second semester, and they're coming to us saying that just didn't work. I've had one family who said, my son does better in online than he does in school, but that's really the exception. Right. Most kids do better when they're in school, and they sort of get into a rhythm, into a school rhythm of going to bed at a certain time, getting up at a certain time. They're with classmates, peers, teachers. They're hearing this stuff repeated over and over again. And online learning just doesn't work that way. Yeah. And so, as you said, when you lose, when a student in the top 10% loses those 3 points, they can catch up in about 9 weeks. So they'll figure out a way to do it. While a low performing students who lost 12 points would take 36 weeks. Right. Well, that's a whole school year. Right. I mean, and then you're not talking about, you're talking about catching up, but remember that top 10% is also moving forward.
Mhm.
So in effect, you probably will never catch up.
Right. Yeah, and we are seeing this play out in a lot of ways,
Oh yeah.
not just academic. We're seeing it played out behaviorally as well. Students students are behaving much differently now than they were prior to the pandemic. And yes, I'm sure that people are very tired of hearing about, well, because of the pandemic this or because of the pandemic that. But these are true effects. These are real effects of the
Right.
pandemic that are having long-term implications on the academics and progression of students. And here in Florida, we're starting this new system, because we're going away from the once a year test, the Florida Standards Assessment, moving away from that to now I can't remember the name of the new thing because it was just recently kind of
Yeah.
publicized. But now it's a 3 times a year, and every student that I've talked to who has mentioned it has said, yeah, it's really great. They went from testing us 1 time a year, now they're testing us 3 times a year.
But it looks the same.
But it looks the same. Looks exactly the same as it always did. And so,
Right.
I'm interested to see what happens with it. But again, we're talking about the same kind of expectations, the same kind of high stakes nature of everything that we're doing in school.
Mhm.
But our students are in a very different place today than they were 3 years ago.
Right. That's right. And what we have to keep in mind is that in effect, when we talk about 30 weeks, we're talking about the entire school year. I mean, the entire school year only lasts 33 weeks.
Right.
And if you take out the first week of school and the last week of school and holidays and different things, you're talking about 30 weeks. And so if you lose 22 weeks of instruction, that's 75% of the school year. And so now these kids are being retested and they're all showing declines.
Mhm.
Okay, they're not doing well on the first assessment. And so the larger problem, and this was brought up by Susanna Lieb at Brown University. She studies educational equality and inequality. And she said, the biggest problem for her is this achievement gap. She said,
Right.
that was one of the things that got exaggerated during the pandemic and after the pandemic, was that the low achieving students lost far more. And so the gap got wider because of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I think that the point that she makes is fantastic, and that is, and so true. Again, if you work in the schools, you see this, that it is already difficult prior to the pandemic. It was already difficult to get those lower achieving students engaged.
That's right. You were working in the schools at that time, and you remember all that. Yeah.
Right. And it was already difficult to get them engaged and get them involved in academics and to have drive, because we've done podcasts before on motivation, and motivation is often derived from achievement. The better you do, the more you want to do it.
Right.
So when you're not doing well at it, you're not going to want to do it very often. And
That's
so
right.
it was already difficult to get many of these students engaged. And so then when the pandemic happened and all of that sort of expected disengagement, because of being out with COVID, because of being out, this or that, now it's even more difficult because they're further behind. So they're struggling even more, and they've already got a year and a half or 2 years of relative disengagement.
Right. That's right.
So it's even more difficult now than it was ever before.
Yeah, and from a practical standpoint, from a teacher standpoint, and this is something that we are beginning to hear now more and more frequent. When you talk about the achievement gap, the problem with the achievement gap is that those are the kids, because it's so difficult, because they're so far behind, they're not as engaged. The achievement gap is leading to a lack of engagement. The lack of engagement, in turn, is resulting in increased behavior problems, which is to be expected, more resistance from those kids. You're going to have more dropouts. They're just going to get discouraged and just drop out. And there's increased stress for students, teachers, and administrators. So now the achievement gap is creating classrooms that are far more difficult for teachers to manage because many students are just not engaged. They just don't care. They're not doing homework. They're not behaving. They're vaping in the bathroom. They're getting to class late. They're leaving early. They're taking days off. And so this lack of engagement is creating classroom environments that are much more challenging for teachers to manage at a time when we have a teacher shortage. So
Right.
you start to see these factors interacting with each other.
Right. And you know, and I was just gonna say that that has been one of the larger casualties and consequences of all this, and that is the loss of a lot of teachers. And
Right.
I know that you do as well. You know, we work with a lot of teachers, but both professionally and therapeutically, and they are struggling. They are having a really difficult time. And, you know, I can't remember the last time I worked with a teacher who felt confident and felt really good about where the situation was in their
Right.
classroom. You know, they're all struggling. They all are dealing with more challenging situations, more challenging behaviors, more challenging academic expectations
Mhm.
than they have before. And
That's
you
right.
know, this has led to, you know, some people like this former superintendent of Chicago schools, Janice Jackson, asking, you know, talking about the federal government initiating ideas
Right.
to help rebuild education
Mhm.
because it is in such dire straits right now.
Right.
Um,
That's right.
so, and I think I don't think she's necessarily wrong. I think that we're going to need something significant to happen, some
Mhm.
significant initiative or plan to to initiate some change, because it's not going to. A lot of districts and a lot of states are trying to go back to the model that was present before the pandemic.
Right.
And I just don't, it just doesn't appear to me to be a climate where that's going to be sufficient, where that's going to work.
That's right. And you're right. I think I hadn't thought about that before, but you remember we used to talk, there is no new normal.
Right,
You know, it's neither new nor normal.
right,
Um, we don't know what new is after this pandemic. And we said that very early on in the pandemic that I don't know nobody knows what it's going to look like
right,
um, because of the pandemic. But you're right. We're trying to we're trying to force the system back to the way it was in 2019,
right,
okay, before the pandemic. And so much has changed, and the problems are so vast and so deep and so broad that I'm not sure that we're going to return to schools as they were in 2019. Too
right,
much has changed. Okay?
right,
So it may be, and this might be an opportunity to rethink the school system. Okay?
right,
Because, you know, we know that we couldn't do high stakes testing today. Too many kids would fail because of the loss of instruction.
right,
And so what Jackson says is we should have like a Marshall Plan, not me, George Marshall, the general who fed Germany, took care of Germany, rebuilt Germany after World War II. We need a massive plan on that scale. The federal government has set aside about $190 billion, and there's about 122 billion left, but that's not going to be enough to fix all that has been damaged because of the pandemic. And so, and the other thing is that all of you who listen to the news are aware that public schools have become a battleground for the election, and people are talking about educational issues. The governor's race in Virginia last year really hinged on what the candidates were saying about education. So schools have become a battleground for politicians and parents. And what she's saying, what Jackson is saying, is politicians, school leaders, teachers unions, parents, we've got to set aside the differences that we noticed during the pandemic. You know, when it comes to banning books, well, parents discovered that their children were exposed to different items. So many parents now have become very vocal about books and what books should be in schools, or gender, or social emotional learning, or critical race theory. And we all have these notions, these biases. And school board meetings have become very contentious. And
Right.
Jackson is saying, we got to put all these differences aside because we got to pull everybody together so that students can recover from all they lost during the pandemic.
Absolutely. And I think that, even though the government has money allocated for some of this, the federal government, it's going to certainly take much more than just allocating money towards it. I think
Right.
they need a plan is needed, and it's not a plan. Sorry for those who may be offended by this, but it's not a plan that politicians are going to be able to come up with. Educators need to be involved, and they need to be educators, developmental specialists, people who are experts in child learning and development and psychology. They need to be involved in the development of these plans because, again, there's just mounting evidence that the learning loss during the pandemic was probably far greater than we anticipated.
Right.
And we have to implement some type of strategy to specifically address that issue. Because
how do you get kids caught up? How do you catch up? Like we often talk about Algebra 1. If you were taking Algebra 1 during the pandemic, you missed weeks of instruction.
right.
Well, no one's going to reteach that in Algebra 2. Algebra 2 is Algebra 2.
Right.
So how do we fill in those gaps that were created by student absence during the pandemic, absence of instruction,
Right.
absence of accountability? And
Right.
so it's going to take a massive effort. And Berney, as we're talking about this, how many teachers have said to you, this is the worst year ever?
Right.
I mean, we thought we'd be out of it, right? And I said, this is the worst year ever.
Right. Yeah. And just another illustration for the situation. I know of schools and have read about schools where, they went last year, they had, we'll just use third and fourth grade as an example, because here in Florida, until through last year, third grade was the critical year. And if you didn't pass the FSA and you didn't meet some other expectations, then you couldn't progress. Well, last year, I know of schools that went from having like 3 third grade classes and 3 fourth grade classes, and because of the performance of the third graders in the on the testing and everything, this year now they're going to have 4 or 5 third grade classes and 1 or 2 fourth grade classes
because they were retained.
So many students had to be retained from the testing. So again, we have this situation where, when the states hold these expectations so firmly, and we're not taking into account and into credit what's going on in the world and what's happening with a lot of these students, this is the situation that we find ourselves in.
Right. They just don't have the skills.
They don't have the skills, and so they're not meeting these expectations, and it's sort of like a code of conduct. We're holding firm these expectations and saying, well, that's it. So 2/3 of a grade level are going to be retained.
That's right. Yeah. And so how do you manage that?
Right.
And we don't know. Other students who might have passed the test still are lacking academic skills. How do you get those skills into them? And I'll remind you, we're only talking about third graders.
Right.
This might also, the only reason we're not talking about other grades is that the data haven't been analyzed yet.
Right.
But we're probably going to see this same thing repeat over the grades. So
right.
This is across grades.
Right. And we're talking about third grade because that's the one where where there's statutes that require students to be retained if they don't pass it. That's why we have the data for those already, because we had to know before the start of the school year. So we know how many third graders we'd have.
Right. So it's a mess for third graders, but it's probably going to be the same picture is probably going to emerge at 5th, 8th, and 10th grades.
Right.
Those other critical assessment years.
Right. So I think what we're kind of working towards is this idea of just considering this impossible task of teaching.
Right.
There's a teacher shortage. The expectations continue to increase. Classrooms are just becoming pressure cookers. As this one author wrote, we posted the link in the show notes to an article from an Injustice magazine, and it is titled "The Impossible Task of Teaching," and it's just talking about how classrooms have just become pressure cookers, both from the pressures from the teachers, from the teachers that are experiencing themselves, from the students, from the administration, from the parents, from the state. There is pressure surrounding the classroom, and you see them explode sometimes.
Right. He uses the metaphor of a pressure cooker, and he said, if everything goes right, a pressure cooker does a fabulous job and everything turns out well. You know, you have enough pressure to have motivation that things turn out well. But he said, if you get too much pressure, and there's a tipping point, get too much pressure, the pressure cooker will explode. And he said, we are approaching, and I think this article was written by a teacher, and he said, we are approaching that point where the pressure cooker is ready to explode. And he said, there's a lot of reasons why we have a teacher shortage. And people who aren't in education don't realize the devastating effect that a teacher shortage is going to have. Mm-hmm. We don't have enough teachers to cover all of our classrooms. So not only do we have all these kids who are behind, but now we don't have enough teachers to fill the classrooms, let alone provide the extra work. Mm-hmm. And this particular person said, we have demands from the left, and he's talking about the political left, and they're clamoring. There's this cacophony, this clamoring for students with special needs. And you know, what we've done is, you know, back in the 70s, we said we need to make accommodations for children with special needs. Well, through the 80s and 90s, those students now have found we now have them in regular classes, and they have accommodations built into IEPs and 504 plans, which are all legitimate, but it adds to the pressure because now you have students with special needs. And if you're in a classroom where you have 3 or 4 kids with IEPs, that adds an enormous amount of work to what you're already trying to do. Right. We also have the whole issue of gender and sexual identity. There are kids coming to school dressed as cats, and they're meowing. These are middle school and high school students who are coming to school acting like they're cats. And then you have the whole issue of gender identity, where you have to use different pronouns and different names, and you have to keep all that in mind. Then you have the whole bullying issue. You have trauma-informed education, the whole problem with masks that people discovered, you know. And then there's all the mental health issues that are now in classrooms, and all the battles over social emotional learning and critical race theory. And so you have all these pressures from the left, and then you have all the pressures from the right.
Right.
And the right,
just the expectations that are there, that the expectations that are put on, especially teachers with performance pay, and the idea of anything you talk about related to, you mentioned social emotional learning and critical race theory and everything like that. And so there's this heightened examination of introducing any political beliefs into the classroom. You mentioned earlier about book banning and the content of textbooks. We've had textbooks here in Florida removed from the classroom because of the perceived presence of issues related to critical race theory. And so you have all of these issues that are, again, from the right, but they're there that have to be constantly be monitored, have to constantly be watched. And there are consequences if any of these things are violated, just like there are from those issues on the left.
Right. Imagine if you were a teacher. One of the things that people many states are doing is a student can go home and tell their parents that a teacher made a comment about slavery or made a comment about anything. And that teacher can be fired because they're mentioning something they weren't supposed to mention. So politicians have passed these laws, and in Florida, there are laws that if a teacher steps over that boundary, they can lose their job or they can be fined. And so this has sent a chill through the educational system. And you say, well, we don't want our schools to be political. Well, what's not political? If a teacher wears a mask, that could be viewed as a political statement. Well, you must be a liberal. You must be a Democrat because, we're opposed to masks. Well, everything you do is political. Okay.
Right.
And so you have banning books, banning critical race theory. Critical race theory isn't taught in schools. Okay. So,
Right.
but why the cloud? So what you have is all these pressures from the left and all these pressures from the right. And then you have demands from above.
Yeah.
You
From
know, the
administration.
pressure from Board of Education to the superintendent to this local school board. And now local school boards are getting involved in these decisions that they were never involved in before. School board meetings have become battlegrounds.
Yeah.
And then you have demands from below. And this is what I think teachers are really struggling with, this, because students are coming in now, many are not engaged.
Right.
But you try to take a cell phone from a student,
Yeah.
and I mean, there have been physical assaults
Right.
on teachers who have asked students, or taken cell phones away from their students, or told to put away.
Right.
You have expectations of students. Students want to come to school and be entertained.
Well,
I expect to have fun.
and not just that, but the expectations that, if a student isn't performing, that you then, the teachers then still has to do something about that. And I don't know. I always had a hard time with this, because if a student refuses to do the work,
Right.
what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
But the teacher is still held, for the most part, still held liable for by sometimes by administration, sometimes by parents, for getting the student to perform. And how do you make a kid do the work?
That's right. Right. And these are kids now we all know the problem with shortened attention span. Okay. The kids just don't have the attention span. And the pandemic added to that.
Right.
When they were home doing school in their pajamas, and they could take breaks whenever they wanted, and they could work as long as they wanted, as briefly as they wanted. Now they're coming to school and they're expected to have a 50-minute attention span, and many of them simply don't.
Right.
They come to school without supplies. They don't have pencils and pens and papers. And many of these students know that if push comes to shove, the parents are going to support them and not the teacher. And teachers know that. Teachers know that I can't push this too far, because I know I'm not going to have it.
I heard about an interesting argument that a student made recently, or I don't know that it was so much an argument as it was a point, because certainly I don't think this came from the student. I think the student probably overheard a parent saying it. But here in our district, we are moving to what they're just referring to simply as one-to-one. So every student, the school district is now giving every student either a laptop or an iPad or a tablet to use. And it's theirs for the school year to use in all of their academics and everything. And this is with the idea that, should we have issues where the student has to be out of school, they still have access to learning content and all this kind of stuff. Well, there was a student recently who said, well, they're giving me this, $1,000 piece of equipment. Nobody asked me if I wanted to use it. Nobody asked me but now I'm liable for it. Now I'm responsible for it. And if something happens to it, I could get in trouble for it.
Right.
But nobody asked me if I wanted to use this. And while I won't say that the student is wrong, but you can certainly understand where the school district is coming from. That's the perspective that the teachers are dealing with.
Right.
The perspective that even when you give them something that's going to help them and to help overcome a lot of obstacles that many students have, that's still a problem for some people.
It's still going to be a problem for somebody.
Right.
Okay. And so when we talk about the pressure cooker that is teaching today, the pressure cooker of the classroom, when people talk about a one-time bonus,
right,
or a 2 or 3% salary increase,
right,
that's laughable. I mean, that's almost insulting to say, well, we'll give you another $1,000, because by the time you take out taxes and everything else, you're talking about $20 a month or $30 a month for a year. That's nothing today. Okay. And so those are really not solutions, no matter how they play politically. A one-time bonus and single-digit salary increases are meaningless.
Right.
And so if these pressures are not released somehow,
right,
the teacher shortage is going to get worse. And we could find ourselves in a real predicament because there aren't enough private schools for all these students. Let's face it. I mean, you'd have to turn all the public schools into private schools in order to house everybody. So you say private education, that's not going to solve the public school problem. Okay?
Right.
It's going to solve the problem for some families, but it's not going to solve the problem for public education.
Absolutely. So as we're kind of wrapping up for this week, I think it's important that we take a moment just to talk about, just to remind everyone about what school is for.
Right.
School is for everyone.
Right.
You mentioned in the 1970s with IEPs and special education and everything. That was part of the reason that was formalized, is because every student until they're 22, they reach their 22nd birthday, public education is available to them.
That's right. From the 1950s on, we made education available for students of color, with the civil rights movement, and students with special needs. So we broadened the appeal and said, no, the school's for everybody. Okay, we want everybody to have a free public education.
Right.
Schools are where we learn to tolerate each other.
Yeah.
We learn that history is a messy business. There were things that happened that shouldn't have happened. And we learned how to negotiate, not demand, but to negotiate.
Right. And it's for, improvement, social mobility.
Right.
We go to school so that we can learn and build and gain skills so that we can progress and improve our life circumstances.
Right.
That doesn't really happen anywhere else. Or it takes much longer for that to happen if you wait until you're an adult and you can get a job and you can work your way up in a company or something.
Right.
Social mobility available through academics and education helps you get to that point so that you can start at a higher level than you would have otherwise.
Right. And how many times education is the surest way out of poverty?
Right.
If you want to improve yourself, get an education.
Right.
So if you want people to improve, the place to begin that is in the public schools.
Absolutely. And it goes without saying that, schools, sadly, schools are the place where, a lot of students just that's where they receive care. That's where they can go to make sure that they're eating every day, that they're, that they're clean and that they're taken care of, and that they sometimes receive medical care. That's where they go to get that because they wouldn't get it otherwise.
That's right. Food is the most important one. During the pandemic, we had school. That's where kids eat. Many kids eat at school. If school's not in session,
right,
they don't eat.
Absolutely. So let's remember that and recognize that the research has demonstrated there's been a significant loss of skills. Students are different today than they were just 3 years ago.
Right.
There was a significant loss of skills, and we need a plan to remedy that, because those that are the most affected by that are the students who were already struggling.
Right.
Those are already our most vulnerable, our students who were struggling the most. They were affected more significantly than others. And so we really need to make sure that we're building a plan to address those losses of skills, especially for that population.
Right. And let's remember that teaching is becoming almost impossible. I mean, the demands from everybody's demanding everything. And it puts teachers in a position where you simply can't do the job anymore. There are too many demands. They're too different. They're too diverse. And they're just impossible to meet. The other thing is, I think we should start treating teachers as the professionals that they are. They're highly trained, highly educated, very competent. And students and parents treat teachers as though they're, hired help or something. I don't know. But think about it. Would you allow your children to talk to the pediatrician or the dentist the way they talk to teachers? I mean, they're all professionals. And you wouldn't dare allow your children to treat a pediatrician or a doctor or dentist that way. Right. They shouldn't treat teachers that way either. And then the last thing is, you have to stop. We all need to pause and stop grinding our personal agenda, regardless of how legitimate, how worthwhile, how valuable it is to you. There are other things that we need to do right now. And this is a time when I think it would be good for all of us to put our personal agendas aside and allow teachers to do the jobs that they know how to do. We just need to get out of the way and let them do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, all right. Well, we will, I'm sure we will return to this topic again in future podcasts, because there's just always more to talk about. And, you know, as more research comes out, there'll be more information for us to go pull from.
Right. Yep.
All right. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.